Imagine a place where the fog rolls in at dawn, wrapping around concrete towers built to contain America's most dangerous men, where every footstep echoes for exactly 3.5 seconds down corridors designed by engineers who believed they could eliminate human nature through mathematics, where 2,000 men live in boxes measuring 8 feet by 10 feet, 80 square feet of living space, smaller than most walk-in closets. In 1968, California spent $327 million, nearly $3 billion in today's money, to build what they called the perfect solution to prison violence. Segregation housing units that would prevent coordination, eliminate communication, and break the human capacity for organized resistance through pure architectural control. 18-inch concrete walls, steel doors with food slots, complete acoustic isolation. They built a machine designed to reduce human beings to individual problems requiring individual solutions. But they made one catastrophic miscalculation. They gave violent men one thing more dangerous than weapons, more powerful than freedom, more devastating than any tool they could have smuggled past the guards. They gave them time. Vast, empty expanses of time in concrete boxes, time to think, time to plan, time to organize in ways that no blueprint could predict and no surveillance could detect. What happened next would reshape American corrections forever and create the deadliest prison gang in United States history. Today, we're opening the files on how California accidentally built the perfect laboratory for criminal organization, and why the solution became infinitely more dangerous than the problem it was designed to solve. This is the forensic autopsy of an experiment that succeeded too well, told through declassified documents, architectural blueprints, and the cold mathematics of human storage that turned isolation into coordination. If you're ready to dive deep into the engineering of America's most dangerous mistake, hit that subscribe button and join our community of investigators who demand the real story behind the headlines. The fog rolls in before dawn at San Quentin, thick and silent, wrapping around the towers like fingers of some ancient ghost. It's 4:30 in the morning, and the count begins with the metallic snap of keys against steel rings. Footsteps echo down the corridors. Concrete walls built in 1862 when California still believed in redemption through architecture. The sound bounces for exactly 3.5 seconds before dying in the dampness. 3.5 seconds. Long enough for an inmate to know which guard is approaching, which direction they're headed, whether the footfall is urgent or routine. This is where our story begins. Not with violence, though violence will come. Not with hatred, though hatred will flourish. But with sound. The way noise travels through engineered space. The way concrete and steel can teach men things no manual ever intended. The morning count at San Quentin reveals something profound about human engineering. 2,328 men, catalogued and verified twice daily since 1971, when the new segregation units came online. Each man a number called out through reinforced doors, each response echoing off walls designed by architects who never imagined they were building something that would outlive their grandchildren. The coastal winds off San Francisco Bay cut through the yard at 23 miles per hour on average, carrying the salt smell of freedom just beyond the razor wire. The temperature hovers at 54 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to sap energy, not cold enough to justify indoor time. This is deliberate. Everything here is deliberate. The concrete was poured to specific ratios, 60% aggregate, 40% cement, designed to absorb sound while reflecting cold. The yard dimensions, exactly 150 feet by 200 feet, large enough to prevent claustrophobia lawsuits, small enough to maintain sightlines from a single tower. But the most important dimension isn't written in any blueprint. It's the distance between men, 6 feet apart during movement, 12 feet apart during yard time, close enough to whisper, far enough to prevent immediate violence, close enough to organize. The architects never calculated that distance. They never imagined how powerful proximity could be when measured not in feet, but in years. The fog lifts by 6:15, revealing the geometric precision of institutional control. Guard towers positioned at angles that eliminate blind spots, or so the manual claims. But fog changes everything. Fog creates shadows where none should exist. Fog muffles the sound that normally travels 3.5 seconds down the corridors. In the fog, whispers carry farther than shouts. In the fog, order depends entirely on silence. And silence, as we'll discover, has its own architecture. The year is 1968. California burns with riots and protests, while inside the state capitol, budget meetings stretch past midnight. The agenda item appears innocuous enough. Correctional facility improvements. Fiscal year 1968-1969. Line item 247. $327 million, adjusted for inflation to nearly $2.8 billion in today's currency. The money will build something unprecedented in American corrections, not just walls, but a new kind of human container. Governor Ronald Reagan signs the appropriation on a Tuesday morning, surrounded by men in dark suits who speak in the language of efficiency. Words like cost-effective and streamlined operations fill the briefing papers. What they're really discussing is fear. Fear of riots. Fear of losing control. Fear that the old model of prison, with its workshops and education programs, has become too expensive, too complicated, too human. The solution lives in a single sentence buried on page 47 of the appropriation bill. Facilities shall be designed to maximize security through architectural isolation rather than programmatic intervention. Architectural isolation. 6 words that will reshape the meaning of punishment in America. 6 words that will, over the next decade, create the conditions for something darker than anything their authors imagined. The blueprint arrives at the Department of Corrections in August, 93 pages of technical drawings that read like a manual for human storage. Segregation housing units, they're called. SU units. The acronym sounds clean, medical, like something that might cure rather than contain, but buried in the specifications are dimensions that tell a different story. Cell size, 8 feet by 10 feet. 80 square feet of living space, smaller than most walk-in closets. Door width, 36 inches, standard for institutional efficiency. Window dimensions, 4 inches by 24 inches, angled at 15 degrees to prevent line-of-sight contact between cells. Concrete thickness, 18 inches, rated to contain sound below 35 decibels. The human voice, speaking normally, registers at 60 decibels. The human scream reaches 110. Do the math. 18 inches of concrete reduces 110 decibels to silence. The engineers who draft these specifications are not cruel men. They are efficient men. They solve problems with precision and mathematics. The problem, as presented to them, is simple. Too many inmates in too little space with too few guards. The solution, they believe, is equally simple. Design space that requires fewer guards by eliminating the variables that create disorder. Remove movement. Remove congregation. Remove the possibility of coordinated action. What they create instead is time. Vast, empty expanses of time in 8 by 10 foot boxes. Time for the human mind to organize itself in ways that no blueprint can anticipate. The construction begins in September of 1968, with foundation pouring that will take 11 months to complete. The site sits on 47 acres of coastal granite, stone so hard that dynamite can only crack it in 6-foot sections. The workers joke that they're building something meant to last forever. They have no idea how right they are. The concrete arrives in trucks that pour continuously for 16 hours a day. The mixture is specific: Portland cement, crushed granite aggregate, and a chemical additive that increases density by 12%. This concrete will cure harder than most residential foundations. It will absorb impact without cracking. It will conduct cold more efficiently than heat. It will, in its final form, create an environment where the human body loses heat 18% faster than normal. Again, this is not cruelty. This is engineering. The cold keeps inmates in their bunks longer, reducing movement and potential conflict. The density prevents improvised weapons from chipping useful fragments. The acoustic properties ensure that guards can hear trouble before it spreads. Every specification serves the central goal: control through environmental manipulation. But no blueprint accounts for adaptation. No engineering manual explains what happens to the human spirit when it's compressed into 80 square feet of controlled space. No architectural drawing can predict the way men will use forced proximity and artificial scarcity to create something that transcends the intentions of their containers. The first segregation housing unit opens on March 15, 1971, with a ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by correctional officials and local politicians. The photographs show clean corridors lined with steel doors, each marked with a number, each containing 80 square feet of California's newest solution to institutional disorder. The officials tour the facility with pride, noting the efficiency of the design. Single guards can monitor 40 cells from a central station. Food delivery requires only 2 staff members per housing block. Recreation time can be managed with mathematical precision, 1 inmate per yard section, 30 minutes per rotation, 0 possibility of congregation. The press coverage focuses on the cost savings. Staffing requirements drop by 37% compared to traditional housing. Education programs are eliminated. No space, no need. Job training disappears, no workshops, no equipment, no congregate activities that might foster coordination. The budget allocates funds for concrete and steel, cameras and locks. Human services become a luxury the state can no longer afford. Warden James Blake stands before the cameras and describes the facility as a new model for institutional security. The words sound progressive, forward-thinking. What he doesn't mention is that the model depends on a simple mathematical equation: fewer people plus more rules equals greater control. What he can't anticipate is that this equation will solve itself in ways no one intended. The first inmates enter the segregation housing unit on a Tuesday morning in late March. They arrive in handcuffs and shackles, transported individually to prevent coordination. Each man receives an orientation packet that explains the rules in clear, simple language. Meal times, recreation schedules, visiting procedures, disciplinary processes. Everything is predictable. Everything is controlled. What the orientation packet doesn't explain is how time moves differently in 80 square feet of space. How minutes stretch into hours when there's nothing to measure them against. How the mind, deprived of external stimulation, turns inward and begins to organize itself around the only variables that remain: memory, planning, and the distant sound of other human voices. The cells are arranged in a specific pattern, 12 per corridor, 2 corridors per housing unit. Each inmate can hear the others, footsteps, coughing, the scrape of metal against concrete, but cannot see them during normal operations. This acoustic isolation creates something unexpected: a community defined entirely by sound. Men learn to recognize each other by the rhythm of their movements, the timbre of their voices during the brief moments when speech is permitted. Communication becomes currency in this engineered environment. A whispered name travels from cell to cell like electricity through wire. Information about guards' schedules, about policy changes, about the world beyond the walls. All of it passes through concrete barriers designed to prevent exactly this kind of coordination. But perhaps most importantly, stories begin to form. Stories about who belongs where, about what this place is for, about what it means to survive 8 feet by 10 feet of controlled existence. These stories don't appear in any correctional manual. They emerge from the intersection of human nature and architectural constraint, from the space between what the system intends and what the system creates. The first organized group forms on a Thursday evening in June, exactly 93 days after the segregation housing unit opens. 3 men, cells 12 apart, who discover they share something more than proximity. They share a belief that survival in this place requires something stronger than individual endurance. They don't call it a gang. They call it a pact. The distinction matters. A gang implies crime, violence, antisocial behavior. A pact implies survival, protection, mutual aid in the face of institutional indifference. The pact begins with simple agreements. Share information about guard rotations. Watch each other's backs during the brief moments of yard time. Maintain silence about personal business that might be used for official leverage. The communication system develops organically, tapping on plumbing pipes during specific hours. coded conversations during meal distribution, glances and gestures during the precisely choreographed movements between cells and yards. Nothing written, nothing recorded, nothing that leaves evidence for official investigation, just human voices and human memory, creating order in a place designed to eliminate it. The pact spread slowly, carefully, through networks of trust built over months of shared isolation. Not every inmate joins. Some prefer solitude. Some fear the additional scrutiny that comes with group membership. But enough men find value in the arrangement to create something that transcends individual survival. Collective resistance to the psychological pressure of engineered isolation. They develop customs, unwritten rules about conduct and loyalty. They create a hierarchy based not on violence or intimidation, but on reliability and intelligence. They establish procedures for conflict resolution that depend on consensus rather than force. In every way that matters, they form a government within a government, a social structure that operates in the spaces between official policy. The officials notice none of this. The metrics they track show success: fewer disciplinary incidents, lower rates of visible conflict, reduced demands for medical and psychological services. The segregation housing unit appears to be working exactly as designed. Men are contained. Order is maintained. The experiment in architectural control seems to be proving its worth. But buried in the success statistics is a truth that no metric can capture: the difference between compliance and submission. The inmates appear compliant because they've learned to organize their resistance in ways that don't trigger official attention. They submit to the rules while creating new rules of their own. They accept their containers while building something inside those containers that their architects never imagined. The pact hardens into something more formal over the summer months. Oaths are spoken in whispers during yard time. Commitments are made that extend beyond individual release dates. Men begin to think of themselves not just as temporary residents of the segregation housing unit, but as members of something that will outlive their individual sentences. They call themselves brothers. The word carries weight in this place where blood family becomes abstract and institutional family becomes survival. Brothers watch out for each other. Brothers share resources and information. Brothers maintain loyalty even when, especially when, that loyalty is tested by official pressure. The Brotherhood develops its own internal culture, borrowing elements from military organization, religious communities, and street associations. Ranks emerge based on time served and reliability demonstrated. Territories form around cell blocks and yard sections. Rules crystallize about acceptable behavior and required obligations. Most importantly, the Brotherhood develops a worldview that explains their situation and justifies their response. They are not criminals being punished. They tell themselves and each other. They are political prisoners being warehoused by a system that fears their potential for resistance. The segregation housing unit is not a tool for rehabilitation. It's a weapon for breaking the human spirit. Their organization is not a gang. It's a survival mechanism in the face of institutionalized dehumanization. This ideology becomes the foundation for everything that follows. It provides meaning for the meaningless hours in 8 by 10-foot cells. It creates purpose in a place designed to eliminate purpose. It transforms isolation from a punishment into a test of commitment to something larger than individual comfort. The summer ends with a ceremony of sorts. Nothing dramatic or visible to the guards, just a series of quiet moments during yard time when commitments are renewed and membership is formally acknowledged. New members are inducted through a process that combines ritual and practical testing. The Brotherhood has become something real, something permanent, something that transcends the intentions of its concrete and steel container. By autumn, what began as a simple survival pact has evolved into something unprecedented in American corrections: a highly organized, ideologically coherent, ethnically exclusive organization that operates entirely within the constraints of maximum security isolation. The Brotherhood has learned to use the tools of institutional control: silence, routine, enforced proximity, to build something that institutional control was designed to prevent. The officials remain unaware. The metrics still show success. Order is maintained through architectural isolation, just as the engineers promised. What the metrics can't measure is the difference between the absence of visible disorder and the presence of invisible organization. What the officials can't see is that their solution has become someone else's opportunity. The first winter in the segregation housing unit arrives with storms that test the building's design. Rain pounds the concrete for days, creating a constant acoustic backdrop that masks the subtle sounds of human communication. The cold seeps through 18-inch walls, dropping cell temperatures to levels that require constant movement to maintain body heat. These conditions intensify everything. The bonds between brothers grow stronger under shared hardship. The ideology becomes more refined as men have endless hours to think and discuss. The organization becomes more sophisticated as its members learn to coordinate complex activities under the constant surveillance of institutional routine. By December, the Brotherhood has established what can only be called a government. Leadership roles are clearly defined. Information flows through established channels. Decisions are made collectively and enforced universally. Justice is administered according to internal rules that supersede official regulations when the two conflict. Most remarkably, this government operates without violence. Physical force is seen as crude, inefficient, and likely to attract official attention. Instead, the Brotherhood relies on psychological pressure, social isolation, and the withdrawal of protection and privilege. In a world where survival depends on group membership, expulsion becomes a punishment worse than any official sanction. The year ends with the Brotherhood fully established as the de facto authority within the segregation housing unit. What began as an experiment in architectural control has become something entirely different, a laboratory for the development of alternative social organization under conditions of extreme constraint. The pact has hardened into policy. The whispers have become law. The silence has been filled with the sound of something new organizing itself in the spaces between the concrete and steel, something that will outlive every reform and outlast every good intention, something that will prove more durable than the walls designed to contain it. The machine is running now, exactly as intended and nothing like intended. The fog will lift again tomorrow morning, revealing the same geometric precision, the same controlled distances, the same careful architecture of human storage. But inside those 8 by 10-foot boxes, something unprecedented in American corrections has taken root. Something that calls itself Brotherhood, but will become something else entirely. The bell rings at 5:47 each morning, a sound engineered to carry exactly 400 yards through concrete corridors. It's not a pleasant sound. 3 sharp bursts of metallic tone designed by acoustics engineers to penetrate sleep without causing hearing damage. The frequency, measured at 2000 Hz, cuts through the ambient noise of ventilation systems and heating pipes with mathematical precision. This is the sound that begins each day in the segregation housing unit. Not the sun, not hunger, not human choice, but a mechanical command that transforms 2,300 men into a synchronized organism of institutional compliance. The bell rings, and within 90 seconds, every inmate must be standing at his cell door for a morning count. 90 seconds, measured not in human time, but in institutional efficiency. The count takes exactly 14 minutes when performed correctly. Cell doors open in sequence. A sound like thunder rolling down concrete corridors as 240 steel mechanisms engage simultaneously. Each inmate states his number clearly enough to be heard through reinforced glass. Each guard marks a checklist with mechanical precision. The mathematics are simple. 14 minutes, 4 times daily, equals 56 minutes of human inventory. Nearly an hour each day spent proving that every body remains exactly where the system placed it. But mathematics, as the Brotherhood has learned, can be subverted by those who understand it intimately. The count requires precision, and precision creates predictability. Predictability creates opportunity. When every guard must be in a specific location at a specific time, the spaces between become briefly invisible. When every inmate must respond at the exact moment his number is called, the rhythm of voices creates a kind of code that travels faster than official information. The breakfast bell rings at 6:15, initiating a choreography of controlled movement that would impress any industrial engineer. Food carts arrive at predetermined stations. Cell doors unlock in calculated sequences. Inmates move through corridors in single file, maintaining regulation distances, following paths marked in yellow paint that guide traffic flow like an assembly line for human beings. The meal itself takes exactly 12 minutes to distribute and consume. 12 minutes measured from the moment the first tray slides through the first slot to the moment the last tray is collected and counted. The menu rotates on a 14-day cycle, providing exactly 2,400 calories per day, distributed across 3 meals that meet federal nutrition standards at a cost of $4.37 per inmate. But the most important thing about breakfast isn't the food. It's the information that travels with it. Kitchen workers see delivery schedules, guard rotations, administrative memos left unattended on clipboards. This intelligence moves through the food service line like electricity through a circuit, passing from worker to inmate to cell block with a speed that official channels can't match. The yard bell rings at 8:30, weather permitting. Weather permitting. 3 words that carry more weight than any regulation in the manual. Fog delays yard time. Rain cancels it entirely. High winds trigger security reviews that can extend lockdowns indefinitely. The weather becomes a variable that the Brotherhood cannot control but can certainly exploit. On clear days, yard time reveals the true architecture of power within the segregation housing unit. Inmates move through outdoor spaces in groups of 12, supervised by guards positioned at angles that provide maximum visual coverage. The yard itself is divided into sections marked by painted lines, boundaries that appear administrative but function as territories in a geography that no official map acknowledges. Exercise equipment consists of pull-up bars, parallel bars, and concrete blocks painted white to serve as weights. No loose equipment that might become weapons. No group activities that might encourage coordination. Nothing that isn't bolted down or too heavy to move. Yet within these constraints, the Brotherhood has developed communication systems that would challenge any intelligence analyst. A specific sequence of exercises signals the transfer of information. The timing of movements around the yard's perimeter carries meaning that transcends recreation. Even the pattern of perspiration on concrete becomes a kind of writing that disappears with the next rain, but conveys urgency to those trained to read it. The locks throughout the segregation housing unit tell their own story of institutional priorities. Each cell door requires 3 separate locking mechanisms: a primary deadbolt rated for 5,000 pounds of force, a secondary bolt that engages automatically during emergencies, and a manual override that functions only with supervisor-level keys. The redundancy costs an additional $900 per door, multiplied across 240 cells, equals $216,000 spent on the philosophy that human beings, given the opportunity, will try to be somewhere other than where the system requires them to be. But redundancy creates complexity, and complexity creates failure points that careful observation can catalog. The primary locks engage with a distinctive sound, a heavy thunk that resonates differently when the mechanism is properly aligned versus when wear and maintenance issues create fractional delays. The secondary bolts emit a higher-pitched click when they engage, audible to inmates whose cells are adjacent to corridors where guards walk. Most importantly, the manual overrides require physical keys that create acoustic signatures specific to each lock. Master keys sound different from unit keys. Emergency keys produce a distinctive scraping noise when inserted quickly under stress. Day shift keys are newer and operate more smoothly than night shift keys that have seen months of additional wear. The maintenance schedule for these locks follows federal guidelines: monthly lubrication, quarterly alignment checks, annual replacement of high-wear components. But budget constraints mean that actual maintenance happens when problems become impossible to ignore. Hinges begin squealing weeks before they're addressed. Deadbolts develop play that creates fractional gaps in security. Override keys wear down until they require extra pressure and additional time to function properly. These maintenance delays become intelligence opportunities for inmates who have learned to treat every sound as information. The squeal of poorly lubricated hinges announces guard movements from 30 feet away. deadbolts with mechanical play can be manipulated to signal other inmates during the brief moments when cells are unlocked for approved movement. Worn keys create additional seconds of vulnerability when guards struggle with stubborn locks during emergency procedures. The Brotherhood maps these vulnerabilities with scientific precision. Which locks fail most frequently? Which guards carry which keys? Which maintenance schedules create windows of opportunity for activities that require split-second timing? Information that would seem trivial to administrators becomes tactical intelligence for men who have years to study every detail of their environment. Time moves differently in segregation housing. Not just the subjective experience of isolation, though 23 hours daily in 80 square feet of space creates psychological effects that no study has adequately measured, but the objective reality of institutional scheduling that reduces human existence to a series of programmed responses to mechanical signals. The evening meal bell rings at 4:30, regardless of natural light or circadian rhythm. Recreation periods are measured in 30-minute increments, timed to the second to maximize facility usage while minimizing opportunities for congregation. Shower schedules rotate through the housing unit on a 48-hour cycle, providing each inmate with exactly 6 minutes of hot water every other day. This mechanical precision serves administrative efficiency, but it also creates something the architects never intended: a community synchronized to institutional rhythm with military precision. When every man knows exactly what time it is by which bell is ringing, when every daily event occurs with predictable regularity, the few moments that deviate from routine become extraordinarily significant. A guard who arrives 3 minutes late for shift change. A maintenance worker who spends an extra 5 minutes checking a problematic lock. A kitchen delivery that arrives early because of light traffic on the access road. These variations in routine create gaps in surveillance, opportunities for communication, windows of time that can be exploited by people who have learned to measure opportunity in seconds rather than hours. The Brotherhood has developed a corporate structure that would be familiar to any business school graduate. Leadership roles are clearly defined: shot callers who make strategic decisions, lieutenants who oversee daily operations, soldiers who carry out specific assignments, and prospects who prove their reliability through increasingly important tasks. Communication flows through established chains of command using methods that leave no physical evidence. Information passes through whispered conversations during yard time, coded messages delivered through routine interactions, and signals that use the ordinary sounds and movements of institutional life to convey extraordinary meaning. The decision-making process operates on principles of consensus and hierarchy that balance individual initiative with collective discipline. Major policy changes require approval from leadership councils that meet through coordinated yard time and strategic positioning during meal distribution. Disciplinary actions follow internal procedures that ensure consistency and prevent the arbitrary exercise of power that might destabilize the organization. Most importantly, the Brotherhood has developed standard operating procedures for every aspect of institutional life: how to respond to official questioning without providing useful information, how to maintain organizational loyalty while avoiding additional criminal charges, how to exploit the gap between institutional rules and institutional enforcement in ways that advance collective goals without triggering systematic crackdowns. These procedures are never written down. They exist only in human memory, transmitted through oral tradition like sacred texts in societies where literacy is forbidden. New members learn through observation and gradual inclusion in activities of increasing sensitivity. Veterans maintain institutional knowledge through constant repetition and teaching, ensuring that organizational wisdom survives transfers, releases, and the inevitable attrition of long-term incarceration. The most sophisticated aspect of this corporate model is its approach to violence. Unlike street gangs that depend on physical intimidation and visible displays of force, the Brotherhood has learned that violence attracts official attention and disrupts the careful equilibrium that allows the organization to function within institutional constraints. Instead, they've developed systems of social control that operate through psychological pressure and economic manipulation. In a world where commissary privileges, cell assignments, and protection from harassment represent scarce resources, the withdrawal of organizational support becomes a punishment that can destroy an individual's quality of life without leaving marks that trigger medical reports or internal investigations. This approach requires extraordinary sophistication and discipline. Members must be trained to distinguish between personal grievances and organizational imperatives. Conflicts must be resolved through established procedures rather than immediate physical response. Retaliation must be calculated, proportional, and designed to achieve strategic goals rather than emotional satisfaction. The result is an organization that operates with the efficiency of a corporation and the loyalty of a military unit, embedded within an environment designed to prevent exactly this kind of coordination. The guards, kitchen workers, maintenance staff, and administrative personnel who operate the segregation housing unit have their own systems and routines, their own ways of adapting to an environment that demands constant vigilance while providing minimal resources. They work within constraints that mirror in many ways the constraints faced by inmates: rigid schedules, limited autonomy, constant observation from supervisors who evaluate performance based on metrics that measure compliance rather than creativity. These parallel constraints create opportunities for unofficial cooperation that no training manual acknowledges. Guards who are tired of confrontation learn to ignore minor infractions that don't threaten institutional security. Kitchen workers who face impossible deadlines accept help from inmates who have legitimate reasons to be in food service areas. Maintenance personnel dealing with aging infrastructure rely on inmates who possess practical skills in plumbing, electrical work, and general repair. These interactions create information exchanges that flow in directions the official organizational chart never anticipated. Guards learn which inmates can be trusted with small responsibilities and which ones represent genuine security threats. Inmates learn which staff members will treat them with basic human dignity, and which ones view every interaction as an opportunity to assert dominance. More importantly, these exchanges create blind spots in official surveillance. Conversations between guards and inmates that appear to be about work assignments may actually involve intelligence about policy changes, personnel transfers, or security vulnerabilities. Routine maintenance activities that require multiple staff members to be in specific locations at specific times create brief windows when normal observation protocols are relaxed. The Brotherhood maps these blind spots with the same precision they apply to lock maintenance schedules and guard rotation patterns. They know which staff members are most susceptible to manipulation through friendship, bribery, or implicit threats. They understand which official procedures create opportunities for unauthorized activities and which security measures are performance theater designed to satisfy administrators rather than genuine deterrence. Most critically, they've learned to exploit the fundamental contradiction at the heart of institutional operations. The system depends on human beings to implement policies designed to control other human beings, but human beings have needs, weaknesses, and motivations that can't be eliminated through training or regulation. Tool counts happen twice daily, once at the beginning of each maintenance shift, once at the end. Every wrench, screwdriver, drill bit, and utility knife must be accounted for through a process that involves physical inventory, documentation, and supervisor verification. The procedure takes approximately 23 minutes to complete and generates paperwork that creates an audit trail for equipment that costs on average $430 to replace and represents a security threat valued by administrators at immeasurably high levels. But tool counts, like all institutional procedures, depend on human implementation, and human implementation is subject to the pressures of time, fatigue, and competing priorities. Maintenance workers facing impossible deadlines may rush through counts without proper attention to detail. Supervisors dealing with staffing shortages may accept verbal confirmations rather than conducting physical verification. Administrative personnel focused on budget constraints may approve count discrepancies that would normally trigger security reviews. These procedural failures create opportunities that the Brotherhood catalogs with scientific thoroughness. Which tools go missing most frequently? Which staff members are most likely to overlook discrepancies? Which administrative pressures make supervisors willing to accept explanations that avoid paperwork and investigation? The goal is not to steal tools for use as weapons, Such theft would trigger lockdowns that would disrupt organizational operations and bring unwanted scrutiny. Instead, the objective is to create temporary access to implements that can accomplish specific tasks quickly and invisibly. A screwdriver borrowed for 30 minutes and returned before the next count can modify cell fixtures in ways that improve communication capabilities. A utility knife used for 5 minutes can create hiding places for contraband that will survive cell searches conducted according to standard protocols. The choreography required for these temporary acquisitions involves coordination between multiple individuals working within the constraints of surveillance systems, guard rotations, and institutional schedules. The precision rivals any professional heist executed by people who have years to study every variable and perfect every timing. Years pass differently in segregation housing than anywhere else in human society. Not just the psychological effects of isolation, though those effects accumulate in ways that transform personality and perception in fundamental ways, but the objective reality of time experienced in increments of institutional routine, measured by bells and counts and scheduled movements that reduce existence to a series of programmed responses. Men enter the segregation housing unit with sentences measured in years and discover that time moves not in annual increments, but in daily repetitions of identical routines. The same breakfast at the same time delivered through the same slot by the same person following the same script. The same recreation period in the same yard section with the same equipment under the same supervision. The same evening meal, the same evening count, the same lights-out command that ends another day indistinguishable from the day before and the day that will follow. This repetition creates psychological effects that no study has adequately documented. Some men retreat into internal worlds that provide escape from external monotony. Others develop obsessive focus on minute details of their environment, becoming experts in institutional operations that administrators barely understand. A few discover unusual mental clarity that comes from elimination of external distractions and competitive demands. The Brotherhood provides structure that transforms this temporal vacuum into something productive. Organizational responsibilities give meaning to otherwise empty hours. Educational programs conducted through whispered conversations during yard time create intellectual stimulation that official programming eliminated in the name of security. Leadership roles provide purpose that transcends individual survival and connects personal endurance to collective achievement. Most importantly, the Brotherhood creates a timeline that extends beyond individual sentences. Members think in terms of decades rather than years, planning for organizational continuity that will survive their personal release or transfer. They develop institutional memory that preserves tactical knowledge across generations of membership. They create ideological foundations that provide meaning for sacrifices that may not be rewarded within their own lifetimes. This extended timeline changes everything about how decisions are made and resources are allocated. Short-term risks become acceptable when evaluated against long-term strategic goals. Individual hardship becomes tolerable when viewed as contribution to collective progress. Present suffering becomes meaningful when connected to future achievement that transcends personal experience. The result is an organization that operates with planning horizons that exceed those of the institutions designed to contain it. While corrections officials think in budget cycles and political appointees plan for election cycles, the Brotherhood develops strategies that span decades and build capacity for goals that may require generations to achieve. The official reports produced by the Segregation Housing Unit tell a story of unprecedented success in institutional control. Violent incidents down 43% compared to general population housing. Disciplinary infractions reduced by 57%. Medical complaints decreased by 31%. Staff overtime reduced through improved predictability and routine. Budget projections met or exceeded in every category related to security and containment. These metrics generate praise from correctional administrators, budget analysts, and political officials who evaluate institutional performance through statistical measurement rather than qualitative observation. The numbers prove that architectural isolation works exactly as intended, that human behavior can be modified through environmental design, that order can be maintained through engineering rather than expensive programming or intensive supervision, but the metrics measure only what they're designed to measure: the absence of visible disorder rather than the presence of invisible organization. They count incidents that result in official reports, not activities that carefully avoid official detection. They measure compliance with institutional rules, not the development of alternative rules that govern behavior more effectively than official regulations. The most significant metric is the one that doesn't appear in any report: the gap between apparent institutional control and actual power dynamics within the segregation housing unit. Guards maintain procedural authority while inmates exercise practical influence over daily operations. Official rules govern scheduled activities, while unofficial protocols determine how those activities actually function. Administrative policy creates the framework within which the Brotherhood operates, but organizational policy determines how that framework is used. This gap between official metrics and operational reality creates a form of institutional blindness that serves everyone's immediate interests. Administrators can report success to superiors and budget committees. Guards can maintain order without constant confrontation. Inmates can develop organizational capacity without triggering systematic repression. The cost of this blindness won't become apparent until the Brotherhood's organizational development reaches levels that can't be contained through architectural isolation and administrative routine. The metrics that show short-term success in institutional control are actually measuring the early phases of institutional capture by forces that the architects never imagined and the administrators don't recognize. The false calm recorded in official statistics represents not the absence of tension, but the perfect balance of competing forces that creates temporary stability. Like the surface of a lake that appears motionless, while currents beneath generate pressure that will eventually find expression through mechanisms that no measurement system can predict or prevent. The segregation housing unit operates exactly as designed, producing exactly the outcomes its architects intended. Order maintained through environmental control, compliance achieved through systematic isolation, costs reduced through elimination of programming and reduced staffing requirements. Every specification met, every projection exceeded, every promise fulfilled. But something else operates within the same space, using the same resources, following the same schedules, achieving goals that transcend every intention of the original design. Something that has learned to use forced proximity and artificial scarcity to create advantages that translate isolation into organization and use institutional routine as cover for activities that will outlast every reform and outlive every good intention. The machine is working perfectly. The question that no one is asking is, which machine? The weather system moves in from the Pacific on a Tuesday morning in November, carrying atmospheric pressure that drops 3/4 of an inch of mercury in 18 hours. The meteorological data shows wind speeds increasing from 12 to 38 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 52 miles per hour by afternoon. Surface temperature falls from 61 degrees to 43 degrees Fahrenheit in the span of 6 hours. For most people, this represents uncomfortable weather. For 2,300 men contained in concrete boxes designed for coastal California's mild climate, it represents something closer to atmospheric torture. The heating systems, installed according to specifications from 1971, were designed for maximum temperatures of 45 degrees Fahrenheit. When exterior temperatures drop below that threshold, the concrete walls begin conducting cold faster than the heating elements can compensate. Cell temperatures drop to 37 degrees by evening. 37 degrees, cold enough to prevent sleep, cold enough to require constant movement to maintain circulation, cold enough to make the 80 square feet of living space feel like a refrigerated storage unit for human beings. The institutional response follows standard protocol. Distribute additional blankets, reduce yard time, increase hot beverage distribution during meals. But standard protocol assumes that weather represents a temporary inconvenience rather than a tactical opportunity. The Brotherhood has spent months studying how institutional operations change under environmental stress, how guard rotations are modified when outdoor posts become difficult to maintain, how maintenance schedules are compressed when heating systems require constant attention, how administrative priorities shift when comfort complaints threaten to become medical emergencies. The cold front creates exactly the kind of systemic stress that reveals vulnerabilities invisible during normal operations. Guards spend more time indoors, reducing surveillance of outdoor areas that are supposedly uninhabited, but actually serve as communication zones during brief transitions between buildings. Maintenance workers focus on heating repairs, leaving other systems temporarily unmonitored. Medical staff prepare for increased sick calls, reducing availability for routine security procedures. Most importantly, the weather compresses yard time from 30 minutes to 15 minutes per rotation, doubling the number of inmate movements required to maintain the same recreational opportunities. 15-minute rotations mean that guard positions must be maintained for longer periods with shorter breaks. Security checkpoints must process twice as many transitions in the same time frame. The mathematical precision that normally governs institutional operations begins to show stress fractures under the pressure of doubled tempo and environmental difficulty. The Brotherhood recognizes opportunity in what administrators see as crisis management. Compressed schedules create windows when guards are focused on logistics rather than observation. Increased movement creates more opportunities for brief contact between inmates who normally have no access to each other. Environmental stress makes staff more concerned with completing required tasks than with observing subtle deviations from routine. The yard rotations on Wednesday reveal the extent to which normal procedures can be disrupted by seemingly minor modifications to institutional routine. What normally takes 3 hours and 20 minutes to complete now requires 5 hours and 47 minutes. Guards who expected to complete their shifts on schedule find themselves working mandatory overtime. Maintenance staff who plan to use afternoon hours for routine repairs must instead focus on emergency heating system problems. By Thursday morning, the cumulative effect of these disruptions becomes apparent in ways that no single metric can capture. Staff fatigue increases response times to routine situations. Equipment breakdowns occur more frequently when personnel are focused on multiple competing priorities. Communication between shifts becomes less precise when information must be conveyed quickly to accommodate compressed schedules. The Brotherhood maps these changes with the same precision they apply to normal operations. But now the mapping reveals something qualitatively different: systemic vulnerability that creates opportunities for coordinated action that would be impossible under routine conditions. The weather hasn't just made everyone uncomfortable. It has changed the mathematical relationship between surveillance capacity and inmate movement in ways that temporarily shift the balance of institutional control. Friday morning brings the convergence of environmental stress and organizational opportunity that the Brotherhood has been preparing for since the weather reports first indicated the approaching storm system. The temperature drops to 34 degrees overnight, creating ice formation on outdoor surfaces that triggers additional safety protocols requiring increased supervision during any movement between buildings. The yard schedule requires 96 separate inmate movements between 7:30 and 11:15 in the morning. Each movement must be individually supervised according to safety protocols that mandate specific positioning of guards and precise timing of door openings. Under normal conditions, this choreography operates with mechanical precision. Under current conditions, it requires constant adaptation to changing environmental factors and equipment problems caused by temperature stress on aging infrastructure. The timeline begins at exactly 7:43 in the morning, when a heating unit in C block fails, requiring emergency maintenance that pulls 2 guards from their assigned positions to escort repair personnel through secure areas. This creates a 13-minute window when normal surveillance patterns are disrupted, forcing remaining staff to provide coverage that leaves specific areas temporarily unmonitored. At 7:56, the first yard rotation begins 3 minutes behind schedule because ice formation requires additional safety procedures for inmates moving between buildings. The delay cascades through subsequent rotations, creating compression that forces guards to make choices between maintaining safety protocols and adhering to institutional schedules that assume optimal conditions. 8:17 marks the point where compressed scheduling intersects with equipment failure in ways that transform routine stress into systematic breakdown. The sally port between B block and the exercise yards experiences lock malfunction caused by moisture infiltration during the overnight temperature drop. Manual override procedures require supervisor presence and additional time that puts the entire rotation schedule 12 minutes behind target. The mathematics of institutional control depend on precision timing and predictable intervals between security checks. When timing becomes unpredictable and intervals extend beyond design parameters, the surveillance grid begins to develop gaps that careful coordination can exploit. The Brotherhood has studied these mathematical relationships for months, identifying the specific combination of delays and equipment failures that would create exploitable vulnerabilities. 831 represents the moment when preparation meets opportunity in ways that demonstrate the difference between random disruption and coordinated action. The Brotherhood initiates a sequence of carefully planned activities that unfold across multiple locations simultaneously, using the environmental stress and scheduling delays to mask movements and communications that would be impossible under normal surveillance conditions. The coordination required for this timeline demonstrates organizational sophistication that exceeds the capacity of institutional security to monitor or prevent. Multiple individuals must execute specific tasks at precise moments while maintaining the appearance of routine compliance with modified procedures. Information must flow through communication channels that leave no evidence while enabling real-time adjustment to changing conditions. The activities themselves are designed to accomplish strategic objectives without triggering immediate security responses that would interrupt the timeline before completion. Nothing violent, nothing obviously criminal, nothing that creates visible disorder requiring immediate intervention. Instead, a series of actions that appear individually innocuous but collectively represent a demonstration of organizational capacity that challenges fundamental assumptions about institutional control. 847 marks the completion of primary objectives and the beginning of careful withdrawal from temporary vulnerabilities. The Brotherhood has used environmental crisis to accomplish goals that would require weeks of preparation under normal conditions. They have demonstrated that institutional security depends on routine predictability and that disruption of routine creates opportunities for activities that transcend official authorization. Most importantly, they have proven to themselves and to institutional authorities that the segregation housing unit contains forces capable of coordinated action despite architectural isolation and administrative control. The message is subtle but unmistakable. Containment is not control, and control depends on conditions that environmental stress can temporarily suspend. The sirens begin at 8:51, 4 minutes after the timeline completion, when guards conducting routine security checks discover evidence of activities that shouldn't have been possible under existing surveillance protocols. The evidence is subtle: items moved, communications intercepted, signs of coordination that indicate systematic planning rather than spontaneous disruption. The immediate response follows standard emergency procedures: facility-wide lockdown, cell-by-cell search, comprehensive review of security footage and guard logs. But the evidence of what actually occurred during the timeline doesn't fit standard categories of institutional violations. No weapons found, no violence committed, no escape attempted, no contraband discovered. Instead, proof of organizational capability that challenges the fundamental premise of segregation housing as a tool for preventing coordinated resistance. The lockdown continues for 17 hours, while investigators attempt to understand what happened and how it was accomplished. Cell searches reveal nothing more significant than minor contraband violations that occur routinely in any correctional facility. Security footage shows inmates moving according to approved procedures under appropriate supervision. Guard logs document no unusual incidents or deviations from standard protocol. But careful analysis of timing reveals a pattern that can't be explained through coincidence or individual initiative. Multiple activities coordinated across separate housing units with precision that indicates sophisticated planning and communication capabilities. Evidence of organizational structure that operates within institutional constraints while accomplishing goals that transcend official authorization. The investigators face a fundamental problem: how to respond to a demonstration of organizational capacity that involves no specific violations of institutional rules. The timeline accomplished nothing illegal, but it revealed everything disturbing about the gap between institutional assumptions and operational reality. The Brotherhood has shown that segregation housing contains forces capable of coordinated action, despite every architectural and administrative effort to prevent such coordination. The search procedures reveal more about institutional limitations than about inmate activities. Guards trained to look for weapons and contraband find themselves investigating evidence of organization and communication that leaves no physical traces. Administrators accustomed to responding to violence and rule violations must address challenges to institutional authority that operate entirely within official procedures. Cell searches follow standard protocols developed for individual contraband detection rather than organizational investigation. Each 80-square-foot space is examined for hidden weapons, unauthorized substances, communication devices, and evidence of rule violations. The process takes 6 hours to complete and produces inventory lists that catalog every possession down to individual sheets of paper and personal photographs. The search results confirm what sophisticated organizational planning would predict. Nothing significant found, because nothing significant was hidden where routine searches would discover it. The Brotherhood has learned to operate without leaving evidence trails that standard investigative procedures can detect. Their organizational capacity exists in human relationships and shared knowledge rather than physical contraband that can be confiscated and cataloged. The most significant discovery is negative evidence, the absence of materials that would normally indicate the level of coordination demonstrated during the timeline. No written communications, no improvised tools, no unauthorized substances, no modified cell fixtures. No signs of the kind of preparation that such coordination would seem to require. This negative evidence forces investigators to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Brotherhood has developed organizational capabilities that don't depend on physical infrastructure that can be searched and removed. Their power exists in intangible assets, information networks, loyalty structures, planning capabilities that remain intact regardless of physical searches and administrative responses. The yards are sealed for 3 days while investigators attempt to reconstruct the timeline and identify the methods used for coordination. The sealing process involves welding steel plates over windows that provide outdoor visibility and installing additional surveillance equipment in areas that were temporarily unmonitored during the incident. But sealing the yards doesn't address the fundamental problem revealed by the timeline. The Brotherhood operates within the constraints of institutional routine, not in opposition to it. Their organizational capacity doesn't depend on access to outdoor spaces that can be sealed or surveillance blind spots that can be eliminated through additional equipment. The investigation interviews are conducted according to standard procedures designed for individual rule violations rather than organizational analysis. Each inmate is questioned separately about their activities during the timeline, their knowledge of coordination among other inmates, and their awareness of planning that preceded the demonstrated activities. The interviews reveal the sophistication of organizational discipline within the Brotherhood. Responses are consistent without being identical, demonstrating coordination in preparation for official questioning. Information is withheld without obvious evasion, showing understanding of legal boundaries that separate required cooperation from voluntary assistance in investigations that might damage organizational interests. Most significantly, the interviews demonstrate that individual members understand their role within larger organizational structures, while maintaining plausible deniability about specific coordination and planning. They can acknowledge routine interactions with other inmates while denying knowledge of systematic preparation. They can explain their personal activities while avoiding information that would reveal collective planning. The investigators discover that traditional interrogation techniques designed for individual suspects are inadequate for organizational investigation. The Brotherhood's distributed structure means that no single individual possesses complete information about planning and coordination. Their disciplinary culture means that members are prepared to accept individual consequences rather than provide information that damages collective interests. The incentive structures that normally encourage cooperation during institutional investigations operate differently when inmates belong to organizations that provide protection, purpose, and identity stronger than anything official systems can offer. Disciplinary consequences that would motivate individual compliance become irrelevant when measured against organizational benefits that transcend personal comfort. The investigation concludes after 2 weeks with findings that satisfy administrative requirements while failing to address underlying issues revealed by the timeline. Individual violations are identified and punished according to standard procedures. Additional security measures are implemented to address specific vulnerabilities exploited during the coordination. Staff training is modified to improve recognition of organizational activities that operate within procedural compliance. But the fundamental challenge remains unaddressed. The segregation housing unit contains organizational forces that have learned to use institutional constraints as opportunities for coordination rather than barriers to collective action. The Brotherhood has demonstrated capabilities that architectural isolation was designed to prevent, using environmental crisis to reveal vulnerabilities that routine operations had successfully concealed. The timeline represents a watershed moment in the relationship between institutional authority and inmate organization. Before the incident, administrators could maintain the illusion that segregation housing successfully prevented coordinated resistance. After the incident, they must acknowledge that their primary tool for institutional control contains forces capable of sophisticated collective action despite every effort to prevent such coordination. The response to this acknowledgement will determine whether the segregation housing unit continues to function as designed or evolves into something entirely different. The Brotherhood has revealed its organizational capacity. Institutional authorities must now decide whether to address the underlying conditions that enable such organization or simply increase the level of control required to contain it. The choice they make will determine not just the future of this particular facility, but the direction of correctional philosophy in California and eventually throughout the American justice system. The timeline has ended, but its implications have only begun to unfold. The escalation begins immediately, with administrative directives that arrive within 48 hours of the investigation's completion. Emergency funding authorizations total $4.7 million for facility modifications designed to address organizational vulnerabilities revealed during the timeline incident. The money flows through bureaucratic channels with unusual speed, indicating political pressure that transforms routine correctional administration into crisis response. The modifications focus on isolation, enhancement, rather than programming expansion. Additional surveillance cameras in areas that were temporarily unmonitored during the timeline. Modified cell doors that eliminate acoustic transmission between adjacent units. Restructured movement schedules that reduce opportunities for brief contact during transitions between activities. Every change designed to increase separation rather than address the conditions that make organization attractive to men facing decades in concrete boxes. The construction begins within 2 weeks, funded through emergency appropriations that bypass normal budget review processes. Contractors work around-the-clock schedules to install equipment that will eliminate the communication pathways the Brotherhood used for coordination. The work creates noise levels that make sleep difficult and dust that creates respiratory problems, but these side effects are considered acceptable costs for enhanced security. The budget reallocation reveals institutional priorities with mathematical precision. Educational programming reduced by 67% to fund surveillance upgrades. Medical services cut by 41% to pay for additional correctional officers. Recreation time decreased by 50% to reduce opportunities for coordination. Human services sacrificed for hardware solutions that promise to restore institutional control through technological enhancement. The staff increases focus on surveillance and containment rather than interaction and programming. 43 new positions created for monitoring duties that require constant observation of inmate activities. Existing staff retrained to recognize signs of organization and coordination that standard procedures had failed to detect. Overtime authorized for coverage that ensures continuous supervision during periods when environmental stress or administrative changes create operational vulnerabilities. The technology installations transform the segregation housing unit into something approaching complete isolation. Sound dampening systems that prevent acoustic communication between cells. video monitoring that captures every movement within the facility. Communication interception capabilities that can detect and record conversations during the brief periods when inmates have supervised interaction. But technology cannot address the fundamental problem revealed by the timeline. The Brotherhood operates through human relationships that transcend physical infrastructure. Their organizational capacity exists in shared ideology, mutual loyalty, and collective planning that remain intact regardless of surveillance enhancement or communication barriers. The enhanced isolation actually strengthens certain aspects of Brotherhood organization by eliminating casual social interactions that might dilute organizational focus. When communication becomes more difficult, the communications that do occur become more purposeful and organizationally significant. When contact opportunities decrease, the contacts that remain become more valuable and more carefully planned. The budget numbers tell a story about institutional philosophy that extends far beyond this particular facility. Hardware costs increase by 230%, while programming costs decrease by 54%. Technology expenditures rise to levels that exceed per-inmate costs at most universities, while educational opportunities fall below standards maintained at most high schools. The message implicit in these budget choices is clear. Inmates are problems to be contained rather than people to be developed. Their organizational capacity represents a threat to be eliminated rather than energy to be redirected toward constructive purposes. The solution to coordination among isolated people is more isolation, not engagement that might channel organizational capacity toward goals compatible with institutional stability. The enhanced security measures operate exactly as intended, significantly reducing opportunities for the kind of coordination demonstrated during the timeline. Communication becomes more difficult. Movement becomes more restricted. Surveillance becomes more comprehensive. Every metric related to institutional control shows improvement over previous levels. But the metrics measure only what they're designed to measure: compliance with enhanced restrictions rather than adaptation to new constraints. The Brotherhood adjusts to increased isolation by developing communication methods that operate within tighter surveillance parameters. They adapt to modified schedules by creating coordination systems that require less frequent contact. They respond to technological monitoring by using organizational discipline that depends more on shared understanding than explicit communication. The enhanced isolation creates evolutionary pressure that selects for more sophisticated organizational capabilities while eliminating less disciplined forms of coordination. The Brotherhood that emerges from enhanced security measures is more cohesive, more disciplined, more ideologically focused than the organization that existed before the timeline incident. The unintended consequence of escalated institutional control is the acceleration of organizational development among the inmates it seeks to control. The Brotherhood learns to operate under conditions that would challenge professional intelligence organizations, developing capabilities that exceed anything their original formation required or anticipated. The violence, when it comes, emerges not from the enhanced security measures themselves, but from the pressure they create within human systems never designed for such extreme isolation. The timeline demonstrated organizational capacity. The escalation creates conditions where that capacity has limited outlets for expression other than conflict with institutional authority or internal struggles for organizational control. The cycle completes itself with mathematical inevitability. Architectural isolation creates organizational pressure. Organizational pressure creates demonstration of capability. Demonstration of capability triggers enhanced isolation. Enhanced isolation creates greater pressure that eventually finds expression through mechanisms that no architectural solution can predict or prevent. The segregation housing unit has become exactly what its architects intended: a highly controlled environment where human behavior is shaped through environmental manipulation. But it has also become something they never imagined: a laboratory for organizational development under extreme constraints, producing capabilities that exceed institutional capacity to monitor or contain. The machine is working perfectly, creating exactly the outcomes that its design parameters predict. The question remains: which outcomes and for whose benefit. The years accumulate in the segregation housing unit like sediment in an archaeological dig, each layer representing another cycle of administrative response to organizational adaptation. 1976 becomes 1981, becomes 1994, becomes 2008, time measured not in human experience, but in institutional memory that preserves procedures long after their original justifications have been forgotten. The staff who designed the enhanced security measures retire and are replaced by personnel who inherit their solutions without understanding their problems. New guards learn surveillance techniques developed in response to coordination methods they've never witnessed. Administrators implement policies created to address organizational capabilities they've never encountered. The knowledge that created the enhanced isolation gradually disappears, while the isolation itself becomes permanent institutional architecture. The inmates who demonstrated the coordination capabilities during the timeline serve their sentences and are replaced by men who enter an environment shaped by responses to activities they never participated in. They adapt to restrictions created to prevent coordination they never attempted, learning organizational discipline from predecessors who developed those skills under different conditions for different purposes. But the organizational knowledge transfers more efficiently than institutional memory. The Brotherhood develops training methods that preserve tactical understanding across generations of membership. New inmates learn not just current procedures, but historical context that explains why those procedures exist and how they can be adapted to changing conditions. Organizational memory becomes more comprehensive and more durable than administrative documentation. The result is institutional evolution that favors organizational sophistication over administrative understanding. Each administrative response to Brotherhood capabilities creates selection pressure that eliminates less disciplined forms of coordination while strengthening more sophisticated organizational methods. The enhanced isolation doesn't prevent organization. It creates conditions that produce more advanced organizational forms. The Brotherhood that exists in 1997 operates with capabilities that exceed anything demonstrated during the original timeline. They coordinate activities across multiple facilities through networks that span state boundaries. They maintain command structures that survive transfers, releases, and systematic attempts at organizational disruption. They develop ideological frameworks that provide meaning for sacrifices that may not be rewarded within individual lifetimes. Most significantly, they establish recruitment and training systems that ensure organizational continuity across decades of membership changes. New members are selected not just for reliability, but for intellectual capacity that can contribute to organizational development. Training programs teach not just current procedures, but analytical methods that enable adaptation to changing institutional conditions. The long-term effect transforms the segregation housing unit from a tool for preventing organization into a laboratory for organizational development under extreme constraints. The architectural isolation that was supposed to eliminate coordination becomes the environment that produces the most sophisticated coordination capabilities in the American correctional system. The night shift runs from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 8 hours when the segregation housing unit operates with minimal staffing and maximum reliance on technological monitoring systems. The architecture of control reveals its limitations most clearly during these hours, when human surveillance decreases and mechanical systems must maintain institutional order through automated procedures and electronic observation. The lighting during night shift operates on a schedule designed to maintain circadian rhythm while providing security illumination. Corridor lights remain at 60% intensity. Cell lights reduce to 20% but never complete darkness. Recreation areas maintain full illumination despite being officially closed. The result is an environment where night and day exist as administrative categories rather than natural phenomena. The sound profile changes dramatically after lights out. Ventilation systems become more audible without the masking noise of human activity. Heating pipes expand and contract with sounds that travel through concrete and steel in patterns that inmates learn to interpret like weather signs. Electronic surveillance equipment generates subtle ambient noise that becomes part of the acoustic landscape that shapes communication and coordination. The guard rotations during night shift operate with longer intervals between security checks and greater reliance on electronic monitoring than direct observation. Cameras provide coverage of corridors and common areas, but cell interiors remain largely unobserved during hours when inmates are presumed to be sleeping. This creates temporal blind spots that sophisticated organizations can exploit for activities requiring privacy and coordination. The Brotherhood adapts to night shift conditions by developing communication methods that operate within the modified surveillance parameters. Acoustic signals that use ambient institutional noise as cover. Visual signals that exploit the specific lighting conditions and camera angles. Movement patterns that appear consistent with normal sleep behavior, while actually facilitating coordination and information transfer. The most sophisticated adaptation involves the use of institutional routine as camouflage for organizational activities. Normal sleeping patterns provide cover for mental planning that requires no external communication. Regular movement for authorized purposes, bathroom visits, medical emergencies, legitimate staff interactions, creates opportunities for brief contact that can accomplish significant coordination objectives. The night shift represents 8 hours daily, when the mathematical precision of institutional control relaxes slightly, creating temporal space where human relationships can develop in ways that daylight surveillance prevents. These relationships form the foundation for organizational capabilities that exceed administrative capacity to monitor or prevent. The cumulative effect of 8 hours daily, 365 days yearly for decades, creates organizational development time that institutional control cannot eliminate without abandoning the pretense that inmates retain any human characteristics. The night creates space for something to grow in the concrete boxes, something that daylight surveillance was designed to prevent but cannot reach. The policy changes arrive with great fanfare in 2011, carried by reform-minded administrators who promised transformation of correctional philosophy from punishment-focused to rehabilitation-oriented. The terminology shifts from segregation housing to restricted housing, to administrative segregation, to secure housing units, each name change suggesting evolution in understanding and approach. The budget allocations reflect this philosophical shift with increased funding for mental health services, educational programming, and re-entry preparation. $47 million over 3 years for initiatives designed to address the root causes of institutional organization rather than simply containing its symptoms. The money represents genuine commitment to alternatives to purely punitive approaches to correctional management. The programmatic changes focus on reducing isolation through structured interaction opportunities. Group therapy sessions for inmates demonstrating behavioral improvement. Educational programming delivered through closed-circuit television systems that provide intellectual stimulation without requiring physical congregation. Vocational training opportunities that can be completed within restricted housing units without compromising security protocols. The staff training modifications emphasize de-escalation techniques and recognition of mental health issues that may contribute to organizational behavior. Guards learn to distinguish between coordinated resistance that threatens institutional security and adaptive behavior that helps inmates maintain psychological stability under extremely restrictive conditions. Administrative personnel develop criteria for determining when isolation should be reduced based on behavioral indicators rather than categorical exclusion from programming. But the architectural constraints remain unchanged. The 8 by 10 foot cells continue to provide 80 square feet of living space. The concrete walls continue to conduct cold and isolate sound. The electronic surveillance continues to monitor every movement and record every conversation. The physical infrastructure that shaped organizational development remains intact, while policy changes address only the administrative framework within which that infrastructure operates. The programmatic improvements operate within the same environmental constraints that created organizational development in the first place. Mental health services are delivered through slots in steel doors. Educational programming is received individually in concrete boxes designed to prevent human contact. Vocational training prepares inmates for re-entry into a society that will evaluate them based on their time in environments that bear no resemblance to any community they will ever inhabit. the fundamental contradiction persists. Policy reforms that promise rehabilitation operate within architectural frameworks designed for pure containment. The environmental conditions that created the Brotherhood's organizational capabilities remain unchanged, while administrative procedures are modified to address symptoms rather than causes. The most significant limitation of these reforms is their assumption that organizational behavior among isolated inmates represents pathology to be treated rather than adaptation to be understood. The Brotherhood's coordination capabilities are seen as evidence of antisocial behavior requiring intervention rather than demonstration of human capacity to create meaning and community under extreme constraints. The reforms fail to address the central question revealed by decades of organizational development within the segregation housing unit: whether institutional control that depends on eliminating human social capacity can achieve anything other than the creation of alternative social structures that operate outside official authorization. The measurements that matter most resist quantification. How do you measure the psychological impact of spending 8,760 days in 80 square feet of controlled space? How do you calculate the cognitive effects of receiving human contact only through scheduled interactions conducted under surveillance? How do you assess the social development of people whose primary community consists of others living under identical restrictions? The official studies focus on metrics that administrative systems can track: disciplinary incidents, medical complaints, successful program completion, recidivism rates following release. These measurements generate data that supports policy arguments and budget justifications, but they capture nothing essential about the human experience of extended isolation or the organizational responses that experience generates. The forensic reality is simpler and more profound. 24 years in an 8 by 10-foot box changes human beings in ways that no measurement system can adequately capture. The changes operate at levels that exceed psychological assessment, educational evaluation, or behavioral analysis. They involve fundamental alterations in how people understand time, space, community, authority, and possibility. The Brotherhood represents one response to these changes, not the only possible response, but the response that emerged from specific conditions under particular constraints with certain ideological frameworks. Their organizational development demonstrates human capacity to create meaning, community, and purpose under conditions designed to eliminate all three. The most disturbing aspect of this forensic reality is its replication across institutional settings that use segregation housing as a primary tool for managing difficult populations. The architectural constraints that created organizational development in California facilities produce similar results in Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, and federal institutions that adopt similar approaches to institutional control. The human cost accumulates in ways that economic analysis cannot capture. Generations of men who develop social skills only within organizational structures that operate outside legal authority, intellectual capabilities that serve primarily illegal purposes, and community loyalty directed toward groups that society classifies as criminal enterprises. But the cost includes institutional effects that challenge fundamental assumptions about correctional effectiveness. Facilities designed to prevent organization become training grounds for sophisticated organizational development. Policies intended to eliminate criminal behavior create environments where criminal organization becomes the primary vehicle for maintaining human dignity and psychological stability. The anchor that holds everything in place is time itself. The simple arithmetic of years spent in spaces designed to contain rather than develop human potential. 8 feet by 10 feet times 8,760 days equals an experiment in human storage that has produced results no one intended and consequences no one calculated. The forensic fact that shapes everything else is this: isolation centralizes violence rather than eliminating it. The segregation housing unit doesn't prevent coordination. It creates conditions where coordination becomes more sophisticated, more disciplined, and more ideologically focused than anything that develops under normal social conditions. The blueprints for contemporary correctional facilities reveal the extent to which the California model has become the national standard for managing institutional populations classified as security threats. The architectural specifications that created organizational development in segregation housing units now appear in construction contracts for facilities in 37 states and the federal system. The cell dimensions remain exactly the same: 8 feet by 10 feet of living space, 18 inches of concrete between units, steel doors with food slots designed to minimize human contact. The acoustic engineering continues to prioritize sound isolation over environmental mental health. The surveillance technology reflects improvements in electronic monitoring rather than reconsideration of whether comprehensive observation serves correctional purposes. The budget allocations for these contemporary facilities demonstrate that institutional learning has focused on enhancing control rather than addressing the conditions that make extreme control seem necessary. Construction costs per bed exceed $150,000, representing investment in concrete and steel rather than programming and human development. The staffing patterns replicate the same ratios between guards and inmates that proved inadequate for preventing organizational development in the original segregation housing units. Surveillance technology supplements, rather than replaces human observation, creating institutions that depend on electronic monitoring to achieve control that interpersonal engagement might accomplish more effectively. But most significantly, the contemporary facilities incorporate the same philosophical assumptions that shaped the California experiment: that institutional control requires environmental manipulation, that coordination among inmates represents a security threat to be prevented rather than human behavior to be understood, and that architectural solutions can address social problems without creating new forms of social organization. The results replicate with mathematical precision across institutional settings that adopt these design principles: organizational development that transcends official authorization, coordination capabilities that exceed institutional capacity to monitor or prevent, ideological frameworks that provide meaning for resistance to environments designed to eliminate meaning. The modern echoes extend beyond correctional facilities to immigration detention centers, juvenile institutions, and military brigs that use architectural isolation as a primary tool for population management. The philosophy spreads through professional networks that share architectural solutions without examining their human consequences or organizational effects. Each replication of the California model creates new laboratories for organizational development under extreme constraints. Each facility that adopts segregation housing as a primary management tool discovers that isolation produces coordination rather than preventing it. Each administrative system that relies on environmental manipulation to achieve institutional control creates conditions that favor sophisticated organizational adaptation. The contemporary facilities represent not evolution in correctional practice, but multiplication of an experiment that produced unintended results from its original implementation. The blueprint that was supposed to solve organizational problems within correctional institutions has become the blueprint for creating those problems in institutional settings that never previously experienced them. The echo effect transforms exceptions into standards, experimental approaches into normal practice, and emergency responses into permanent institutional architecture. What began as California's solution to specific problems becomes America's approach to institutional control, carrying consequences that compound across decades and accumulate across jurisdictions. The final audit must address questions that administrative metrics cannot answer: whether institutional security that depends on eliminating human social capacity can achieve anything other than the creation of alternative social structures that operate according to principles that transcend legal authority, whether architectural solutions to social problems create new social problems that exceed the original challenges they were designed to address. The philosophical assessment requires acknowledging that the segregation housing experiment succeeded completely in achieving its intended goals, while simultaneously creating unintended consequences that exceed its intended benefits. The facilities operate exactly as designed, producing institutional control through environmental manipulation, while generating organizational development that transcends environmental constraints. The human beings contained within these facilities adapt to restrictions by developing capabilities that exceed the restrictions' intended effects. They create community under conditions designed to eliminate community. They develop meaning under circumstances intended to eliminate meaning. They establish coordination despite infrastructure designed to prevent coordination. The verdict depends on how we evaluate this fundamental tension between institutional intentions and human adaptations. From an administrative perspective, the segregation housing units achieved their primary objective, containing difficult populations while maintaining facility order and staff safety. From a human development perspective, they create conditions that produce exactly the kinds of sophisticated criminal organization that correctional policy claims to prevent. The economic analysis reveals costs that extend far beyond construction budgets and operational expenses. The long-term social effects include generations of people whose primary experience of community involves organizations that operate outside legal authority. The institutional effects include correctional systems that depend increasingly on technological surveillance and environmental manipulation rather than human engagement and programmatic development. But the most profound cost may be philosophical. The normalization of institutional approaches that treat human social capacity as a threat to be eliminated rather than energy to be directed toward. Imagine a place where the fog rolls in at dawn, wrapping around concrete towers built to contain America's most dangerous men, where every footstep echoes for exactly 3.5 seconds down corridors designed by engineers who believed they could eliminate human nature through mathematics, where 2,000 men live in boxes measuring 8 feet by 10 feet, 80 square feet of living space, smaller than most walk-in closets. In 1968, California spent $327 million, nearly $3 billion in today's money, to build what they called the perfect solution to prison violence. Segregation housing units that would prevent coordination, eliminate communication, and break the human capacity for organized resistance through pure architectural control. 18-inch concrete walls, steel doors with food slots, complete acoustic isolation. They built a machine designed to reduce human beings to individual problems requiring individual solutions. But they made one catastrophic miscalculation. They gave violent men one thing more dangerous than weapons, more powerful than freedom, more devastating than any tool they could have smuggled past the guards. They gave them time. Vast, empty expanses of time in concrete boxes, time to think, time to plan, time to organize in ways that no blueprint could predict and no surveillance could detect. What happened next would reshape American corrections forever and create the deadliest prison gang in United States history. Today, we're opening the files on how California accidentally built the perfect laboratory for criminal organization, and why the solution became infinitely more dangerous than the problem it was designed to solve. This is the forensic autopsy of an experiment that succeeded too well, told through declassified documents, architectural blueprints, and the cold mathematics of human storage that turned isolation into coordination. If you're ready to dive deep into the engineering of America's most dangerous mistake, hit that subscribe button and join our community of investigators who demand the real story behind the headlines. The fog rolls in before dawn at San Quentin, thick and silent, wrapping around the towers like fingers of some ancient ghost. It's 4:30 in the morning, and the count begins with the metallic snap of keys against steel rings. Footsteps echo down the corridors. Concrete walls built in 1862 when California still believed in redemption through architecture. The sound bounces for exactly 3.5 seconds before dying in the dampness. 3.5 seconds. Long enough for an inmate to know which guard is approaching, which direction they're headed, whether the footfall is urgent or routine. This is where our story begins. Not with violence, though violence will come. Not with hatred, though hatred will flourish. But with sound. The way noise travels through engineered space. The way concrete and steel can teach men things no manual ever intended. The morning count at San Quentin reveals something profound about human engineering. 2,328 men, catalogued and verified twice daily since 1971, when the new segregation units came online. Each man a number called out through reinforced doors, each response echoing off walls designed by architects who never imagined they were building something that would outlive their grandchildren. The coastal winds off San Francisco Bay cut through the yard at 23 miles per hour on average, carrying the salt smell of freedom just beyond the razor wire. The temperature hovers at 54 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to sap energy, not cold enough to justify indoor time. This is deliberate. Everything here is deliberate. The concrete was poured to specific ratios: 60% aggregate, 40% cement, designed to absorb sound while reflecting cold. The yard dimensions: exactly 150 feet by 200 feet, large enough to prevent claustrophobia lawsuits, small enough to maintain sightlines from a single tower. But the most important dimension isn't written in any blueprint. It's the distance between men: 6 feet apart during movement, 12 feet apart during yard time, close enough to whisper, far enough to prevent immediate violence, close enough to organize. The architects never calculated that distance. They never imagined how powerful proximity could be when measured not in feet, but in years. The fog lifts by 6:15, revealing the geometric precision of institutional control. Guard towers positioned at angles that eliminate blind spots, or so the manual claims. But fog changes everything. Fog creates shadows where none should exist. Fog muffles the sound that normally travels 3.5 seconds down the corridors. In the fog, whispers carry farther than shouts. In the fog, order depends entirely on silence. And silence, as we'll discover, has its own architecture. The year is 1968. California burns with riots and protests, while inside the state capitol, budget meetings stretch past midnight. The agenda item appears innocuous enough: correctional facility improvements, fiscal year 1968-1969. Line item 247. $327 million, adjusted for inflation to nearly $2.8 billion in today's currency. The money will build something unprecedented in American corrections, not just walls, but a new kind of human container. Governor Ronald Reagan signs the appropriation on a Tuesday morning, surrounded by men in dark suits who speak in the language of efficiency. Words like cost-effective and streamlined operations fill the briefing papers. What they're really discussing is fear. Fear of riots, fear of losing control, fear that the old model of prison, with its workshops and education programs, has become too expensive, too complicated, too human. The solution lives in a single sentence buried on page 47 of the appropriation bill. Facilities shall be designed to maximize security through architectural isolation rather than programmatic intervention. Architectural isolation. 6 words that will reshape the meaning of punishment in America. 6 words that will, over the next decade, create the conditions for something darker than anything their authors imagined. The blueprint arrives at the Department of Corrections in August, 93 pages of technical drawings that read like a manual for human storage. Segregation housing units, they're called. SU units. The acronym sounds clean, medical, like something that might cure rather than contain. But buried in the specifications are dimensions that tell a different story. Cell size, 8 feet by 10 feet. 80 square feet of living space, smaller than most walk-in closets. Door width, 36 inches, standard for institutional efficiency. Window dimensions, 4 inches by 24 inches, angled at 15 degrees to prevent line-of-sight contact between cells. Concrete thickness, 18 inches, rated to contain sound below 35 decibels. The human voice, speaking normally, registers at 60 decibels. The human scream reaches 110. Do the math. 18 inches of concrete reduces 110 decibels to silence. The engineers who draft these specifications are not cruel men. They are efficient men. They solve problems with precision and mathematics. The problem, as presented to them, is simple: too many inmates in too little space with too few guards. The solution, they believe, is equally simple: design space that requires fewer guards by eliminating the variables that create disorder. Remove movement. Remove congregation. Remove the possibility of coordinated action. What they create instead is time. Vast, empty expanses of time in 8 by 10-foot boxes. Time for the human mind to organize itself in ways that no blueprint can anticipate. The construction begins in September of 1968, with foundation pouring that will take 11 months to complete. The site sits on 47 acres of coastal granite, stone so hard that dynamite can only crack it in 6-foot sections. The workers joke that they're building something meant to last forever. They have no idea how right they are. The concrete arrives in trucks that pour continuously for 16 hours a day. The mixture is specific: Portland cement, crushed granite aggregate, and a chemical additive that increases density by 12%. This concrete will cure harder than most residential foundations. It will absorb impact without cracking. It will conduct cold more efficiently than heat. It will, in its final form, create an environment where the human body loses heat 18% faster than normal. Again, this is not cruelty. This is engineering. The cold keeps inmates in their bunks longer, reducing movement and potential conflict. The density prevents improvised weapons from chipping useful fragments. The acoustic properties ensure that guards can hear trouble before it spreads. Every specification serves the central